Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, The Philosophy of Guilt and Redemption. Hook and intro. Have you ever wondered if some individuals are truly above the law, capable of transcending conventional morality for a greater good? What if you believed that a single, audacious act could justify a multitude of benefits, not just for yourself, but for society? And what if, in testing this theory, you plunged yourself into a psychological abyss, finding that the true punishment wasn't external, but an agonizing torment within your own soul? These are the profound questions at the heart of Fyodor Dostoevsky's masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, a novel that continues to grip readers over a century and a half after its publication. Today, we embark on a journey into the suffocating streets and tortured mind of 19th century St. Petersburg, where a young man named Rodion Raskolnikov dares to commit a philosophical murder. Our exploration will not just summarize the intricate plot of this literary giant, but will also dissect the powerful ideas Dostoevsky embedded within its pages. We will unravel Raskolnikov's chilling theory of the extraordinary man, trace his agonizing descent into guilt and paranoia, and ultimately witness his arduous path toward a fragile yet profound redemption. This isn't just a story about crime. It's a monumental psychological study, a searing social critique, and a timeless meditation on morality, faith, and the very essence of human conscience. Crime and Punishment is more than just a detective story where you know the culprit from the start. It is a deep dive into the why and, more importantly, the what next of a morally audacious act. Dostoevsky, a writer whose own life was marked by suffering and profound spiritual awakenings, pours his soul into Raskolnikov's journey, making it a mirror for our own struggles with right and wrong, pride and humility, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. The novel forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, our capacity for both intellectual brilliance and moral depravity, for profound alienation and transformative love. Why does a novel penned in the 1860s still resonate so deeply with us today? Because Raskolnikov's intellectual arrogance, his belief that abstract theories can justify inhumanity, echoes in modern ideological extremism. His psychological torment speaks to the universal human experience of guilt, while his struggle for redemption offers a timeless beacon of hope in a world often marked by despair. This story challenges us to look beyond superficial justifications and to understand the profound, often hidden consequences of our actions, both on ourselves and on the fabric of society. So prepare to be immersed in a narrative that blends the intensity of a thriller with the philosophical depth of a profound meditation. By the end of this video, you will not only understand the intricate plot of Crime and Punishment, but also grasp its enduring power to illuminate the darkest corners of the human heart and the brightest paths to spiritual renewal. Join us as we uncover why Dostoevsky's masterpiece remains an indispensable guide to understanding ourselves and the complex moral landscape we inhabit. Context and background. To truly appreciate the depth of Crime and Punishment, we must first situate it within its turbulent origins. The author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, was a titan of Russian literature whose personal life profoundly informed his work. Born in 1821, Dostoevsky experienced both intellectual ferment and immense suffering. In 1849, he was arrested for involvement in a utopian socialist group. He faced a mock execution, standing before a firing squad only to have his sentence commuted at the last minute to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by military service. This harrowing experience, a direct confrontation with death and the harsh realities of the Russian penal system, irrevocably altered his worldview, deepening his Christian faith and his understanding of human endurance and suffering. Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, emerged from this crucible of Dostoevsky's experiences. It was a response to the intellectual currents sweeping through Russia in the 1860s, a period of radical change following the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. New philosophies like nihilism, which denied objective meaning and morality, and utilitarianism, which emphasized actions that maximized overall happiness, gained traction among the intelligentsia. Dostoevsky viewed these ideas with profound suspicion, believing they could lead to moral chaos and spiritual decay if detached from Christian values and compassion. His novel became a powerful literary exploration of these dangerous intellectual trends. The setting itself, St. Petersburg, is almost a character in the novel. Dostoevsky paints a vivid, often suffocating picture of the city's underbelly. It is a place of stark contrasts. Grand imperial palaces stand alongside cramped, dilapidated tenements. The summer heat is oppressive, the streets are crowded and dusty, and poverty is rampant. Raskolnikov's tiny, coffin-like room, often described with yellow hues, symbolizes his psychological confinement and the sickly state of his mind. This oppressive atmosphere, with its squalor, despair, and moral degradation, profoundly impacts the character's psychological states and contributes to Raskolnikov's desperate mental and financial situation, fueling his radical thoughts. Now let's delve into the intricate plot of Crime and Punishment, a story designed to draw you into the protagonist's fractured psyche. Rodion Raskolnikov is a handsome, intelligent, but desperately poor former law student living in St. Petersburg. He has dropped out of university due to lack of funds and now languishes in his tiny apartment, consumed by a radical, self-serving philosophical theory. He believes humanity is divided into ordinary people who must obey laws and extraordinary individuals like Napoleon who have the right to transgress moral laws, even commit murder, if it serves a higher purpose or benefits humanity. Raskolnikov considers himself one of these extraordinary men and decides to test his theory by committing a utilitarian crime. His target is Alyona Ivanovna, an old avaricious pawnbroker whom he sees as a useless parasite exploiting the poor. He meticulously plans her murder, convinced that taking her life and using her money for good deeds would outweigh the single immoral act. On the day of the crime, he retrieves an axe, his chosen weapon, and approaches her apartment under the guise of pawning an item. He brutally murders Alyona Ivanovna with the axe, taking her valuables. However, his carefully constructed plan immediately unravels. Unexpectedly, Alyona's meek half-sister, Lizaveta Ivanovna, returns home and discovers the gruesome scene. Terrified and realizing he cannot leave a witness, Raskolnikov, in a desperate panic, murders Lizaveta as well. This unplanned second murder of an innocent and gentle soul immediately shatters Raskolnikov's intellectual justifications. The crime is messy, chaotic, and far from the clean, rational execution he envisioned. He barely escapes the apartment, managing to hide the stolen goods and the axe, but his inner world is already in turmoil. The aftermath is swift and devastating, though not in the way he expected. Instead of feeling empowered or liberated, Raskolnikov is immediately consumed by an overwhelming, debilitating guilt, paranoia, and feverish delirium. He falls seriously ill, confined to his room for days, haunted by hallucinations and nightmares. He becomes deeply alienated from his friends and family, convinced that everyone suspects him even when there's no direct evidence. During his illness, Raskolnikov receives a visit from his loyal friend Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumikhin, who tirelessly cares for him. Razumikhin is Raskolnikov's foil, practical, kind-hearted, and resilient. He represents the possibility of honest work and genuine human connection. Raskolnikov's beloved mother, Pulcheria Alexandrovna, and his virtuous sister, Avdiya Romanovna Raskolnikova, known as Dunya, also arrive in St. Petersburg. They are in dire straits financially, and Dunya has accepted a marriage proposal from Fyodor Petrovich Luzhin, a wealthy, self-important, and morally bankrupt lawyer, primarily to save her family from poverty. Raskolnikov despises Luzhin, seeing through his manipulative and egoistic nature, and forbids the marriage. The investigative magistrate assigned to the case is Porfiry Petrovich, a shrewd and cunning man who quickly discerns Raskolnikov's guilt not through physical evidence but through psychological insight. Porfiry engages Raskolnikov in a series of subtle, intellectual cat-and-mouse games, planting seeds of doubt and subtly guiding him towards confession without direct accusation. His methods rely entirely on understanding Raskolnikov's tortured conscience, knowing that the internal punishment is the most unbearable. A crucial figure in Raskolnikov's journey is Sonya Marmeladova, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her impoverished family, particularly her alcoholic father, Semyon Marmeladov, and her stepmother Katerina Ivanovna and their children. Sonya embodies selfless Christian love, humility, and unwavering faith. Raskolnikov, drawn to her profound suffering and spiritual purity, eventually confesses his crime to her. Sonya's response is not judgment but deep compassion. She sees in him not a monster but a suffering soul and urges him to confess publicly and find redemption through penance. She believes that only through suffering can he achieve spiritual rebirth. The narrative also introduces Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, Dunya's former employer, a wealthy, morally ambiguous, and predatory man who had harassed Dunya. Svidrigailov represents a dark, sensual nihilism, a man who lives without moral constraints but who is also haunted by his past. He is aware of Raskolnikov's crime and offers him a cynical escape, a path further into moral depravity. However, even Svidrigailov, after a series of disturbing encounters and haunting dreams, cannot escape the consequences of his own spiritual emptiness and ultimately takes his own life. Driven by his unbearable guilt, Porfiry's psychological pressure, and Sonya's unwavering influence, Raskolnikov finally confesses his crime in a public square, kneeling and kissing the earth as Sonya had instructed. He then surrenders to the authorities. He is sentenced to 8 years of penal servitude in Siberia. The epilogue takes us to Siberia, where Raskolnikov initially remains defiant and cold, still intellectually justifying his actions. He is tormented by the indifference of his fellow prisoners and struggles to connect with Sonya, who has followed him to Siberia. But through Sonya's constant, unconditional love and self-sacrifice and his own prolonged suffering, a slow, arduous process of spiritual awakening begins. The novel concludes with the promise of a new story, the story of Raskolnikov's gradual renewal and his slow progress toward accepting punishment and embracing a new life, hinting at potential spiritual rebirth through his love for Sonya and his acceptance of faith. Core narrative and analysis at the heart of Crime and Punishment lies Rodion Raskolnikov's audacious theory, the idea of the extraordinary man. This theory, articulated in his article and countless internal monologues, divides humanity into two categories. First, the ordinary people who are conformist, subservient, and exist merely to perpetuate the species. They are bound by conventional moral laws and social norms. Second, the extraordinary individuals who possess genius, vision, and the inherent right to transcend these laws if their actions lead to a greater good, to the advancement of humanity, or to the fulfillment of their own destiny. Raskolnikov envisions historical figures like Napoleon as prime examples, men who spilled blood without remorse, driven by a higher purpose, and ultimately hailed as heroes. Raskolnikov believes that the old pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna is a societal parasite, hoarding wealth and exploiting the poor, contributing nothing to humanity. Her death, he rationalizes, would not only free her money to do good but would also rid the world of a harmful presence. This is a twisted form of utilitarianism, an ethical philosophy that aims to maximize overall happiness or utility. He sees himself as an intellectual titan, an extraordinary man, capable of making this difficult, morally transgressive decision for the benefit of many, including himself, as her money would fund his education and potentially allow him to achieve great things. However, Dostoevsky meticulously dismantles this cold, rational philosophy through Raskolnikov's own harrowing experience. The murder itself is far from the intellectual triumph Raskolnikov envisioned. It is a brutal, chaotic, and psychologically shattering event. The unplanned murder of Lizaveta, the meek and innocent sister, immediately introduces a profound moral complication that his theory cannot account for. The act is not a clean execution of a principle, but a messy, visceral violation that plunges him into an immediate crisis. This highlights Dostoevsky's critique of abstract reasoning when it ignores the inherent value of human life and the complex, often irrational, nature of moral action. The true punishment for Raskolnikov's crime is not merely the legal sentence he eventually faces, but the agonizing psychological and spiritual torment that begins the moment he commits the murders. He is consumed by a debilitating fever, vivid hallucinations, and intense paranoia. He becomes convinced that every passerby, every casual glance holds the knowledge of his guilt. His intellectual pride, which spurred the crime, ironically becomes the instrument of his torment, as his brilliant mind now turns inward, relentlessly dissecting his every move, every interaction, searching for clues that might betray him. This internal suffering isolates Raskolnikov completely. He pushes away his loyal friend Razumikhin, alienates his loving mother and sister, and can no longer connect with humanity. He finds himself in a profound state of spiritual solitude, a chasm of guilt separating him from everyone and everything. This alienation is a central motif in the novel, highlighting Dostoevsky's belief that to violate moral law is to sever one's connection not only with others but with one's own essential humanity and with God. Raskolnikov's inability to live with his conscience, despite his intellectual justifications, profoundly challenges the nihilistic premise that morality is an arbitrary construct. Enter Porfiry Petrovich, the shrewd investigating magistrate who becomes Raskolnikov's psychological tormentor. Porfiry doesn't rely on conventional police work or material evidence. Instead, he employs a masterful strategy of psychological warfare. He understands Raskolnikov's intellect, his pride, and his profound internal suffering. In their various encounters, Porfiry never directly accuses Raskolnikov but subtly hints at his knowledge, asking probing questions and playing on Raskolnikov's paranoia. He knows that the true evidence resides in Raskolnikov's own conscience and that the internal torment will eventually force a confession. Porfiry's approach embodies Dostoevsky's profound insight into the human psyche, that guilt is an inescapable burden, a spiritual wound that cannot be healed by intellectual sophistry. For instance, during their second interview, Porfiry subtly brings up Raskolnikov's published article on the extraordinary man. Raskolnikov, eager to defend his theory, inadvertently reveals details that could only be known by the murderer, further tightening the psychological noose. This cunning game highlights the inescapable nature of truth, even when buried under layers of rationalization. The counterpoint to Raskolnikov's intellectual pride and nihilism is found in the character of Sonya Marmeladova. Sonya is forced into prostitution by extreme poverty to support her destitute family, yet she embodies unwavering Christian faith, profound humility, and selfless love. She is a sinner in the eyes of society, but a saint in her spiritual purity and boundless compassion. Raskolnikov, drawn to her suffering and her capacity for enduring life's harshest realities with grace, eventually confesses his unspeakable crime to her. Sonya's reaction to Raskolnikov's confession is a pivotal moment in the novel. She does not condemn him. Instead, she embraces him with tears, seeing not a monster but a suffering human soul. She immediately urges him to confess publicly, to go to the crossroads, bow down, kiss the earth you've defiled, and say to all the world, I am a murderer. For Sonya, suffering is not merely punishment but a path to spiritual purification and redemption. She offers Raskolnikov a small wooden cross, symbolizing the acceptance of his burden and the possibility of resurrection, mirroring the biblical story of Lazarus, whom she reads to him. This act of faith and unconditional love provides the first true glimmer of hope for Raskolnikov. Another crucial figure is Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, Dunya's former employer, a wealthy and depraved man who represents the absolute extreme of Raskolnikov's everything is permitted philosophy, but without any of Raskolnikov's intellectual pretense or moral struggle. Svidrigailov lives solely for sensual pleasure, committing various wicked acts throughout his life. He overhears Raskolnikov's confession to Sonya and uses this knowledge to manipulate Dunya, hoping to force her into a relationship. However, even Svidrigailov, who appears completely amoral, cannot escape the consequences of his actions. He is haunted by dreams and visions, particularly of his deceased wife and a young girl he tormented. His spiritual emptiness eventually leads him to suicide, a tragic demonstration of the ultimate futility of a life devoid of moral compass or spiritual meaning. Svidrigailov's fate serves as a chilling warning, a what if for Raskolnikov. It shows the devastating end of a purely nihilistic path, a life lived entirely without conscience or the hope of redemption. Raskolnikov, despite his crime, still possesses a spark of humanity, a tormented conscience that Svidrigailov utterly lacks. This contrast underscores Dostoevsky's argument that even the most hardened cynic cannot escape the intrinsic human need for meaning and moral connection. Under the combined weight of Porfiry's psychological pressure, Sonya's unwavering love and faith, and his own unbearable internal torment, Raskolnikov finally breaks. He performs the public act of confession Sonya suggested, kneeling and kissing the filthy earth in a public square, a symbolic act of humility and acceptance of his sin. He then surrenders to the police. This moment marks the culmination of his intellectual rebellion and the beginning of his arduous journey towards penance. He is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. The epilogue depicts Raskolnikov in the harsh realities of the prison camp. Initially, he remains proud and defiant, still intellectually superior to his fellow prisoners, still refusing to genuinely repent. His alienation persists. He even wonders why he didn't just kill himself like Svidrigailov. However, Sonya, true to her word, follows him to Siberia, enduring hardship to be near him. Her selfless love, her constant presence, and the sheer suffering of his exile slowly begin to chip away at Raskolnikov's intellectual armor. One day he sees Sonya, pale and thin, waiting for him. He falls at her feet, weeping, his pride finally shattered. In that moment, he realizes he loves her, and this realization is the catalyst for his transformation. The novel ends with the promise of a new story, the story of his gradual spiritual rebirth. Dostoevsky suggests that genuine redemption is not a sudden epiphany, but a long, painful process of renewal, nurtured by love, suffering, and a return to faith. It is not an end but a beginning, a slow ascent from the depths of nihilistic despair to the light of spiritual hope. Deep insight and reflection. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment transcends its 19th-century Russian setting to offer profound insights that remain acutely relevant in our contemporary world. Raskolnikov's intellectual justification for murder, born from his theory of extraordinary men, and fueled by a distorted utilitarianism, serves as a timeless warning against ideological extremism. In our own time, we witness instances where abstract political, social, or religious ideologies dehumanize others, justifying violence, oppression, or even terrorism in the name of a greater good or a higher purpose. And consider the radicalization often seen online, where individuals become so entrenched in an ideology that they lose touch with basic human empathy. Raskolnikov's belief that some lives are expendable for a perceived societal benefit echoes in the rhetoric of extremist groups, whether they are political radicals advocating for violent revolution or those who justify discrimination or harm based on identity. For example, historical instances of genocide or modern acts of terrorism often find their roots in dehumanizing ideologies that echo Raskolnikov's initial premise, that certain individuals or groups are useless or harmful and can therefore be eliminated for the supposed benefit of a larger collective. The novel also offers enduring insights into psychological health and the destructive nature of unacknowledged internal conflict and guilt. Raskolnikov's descent into paranoia, feverish delirium, and social isolation is a harrowing depiction of the psychological toll that moral transgressions take. This is incredibly relevant to modern discussions on mental health, trauma, and the importance of accountability and confession. Many therapeutic approaches today emphasize acknowledging wrongdoing and seeking reconciliation as crucial steps toward psychological healing. For instance, the experience of veterans suffering from PTSD, grappling with actions taken in war, often mirrors Raskolnikov's internal torment, highlighting the deep psychological wounds that moral injury can inflict. Moreover, the novel's exploration of the human quest for meaning and the struggle with faith remains profoundly relevant in a secularizing world. Raskolnikov's initial rejection of traditional morality and his attempt to find meaning solely through intellect and self-assertion lead him to a spiritual wasteland. Sonya, on the other hand, embodies a different path, one of humility, faith, and unconditional love, offering a counter-narrative to purely rationalistic worldviews. This struggle resonates with individuals today grappling with existential angst, seeking purpose beyond materialism, or questioning the role of spirituality in their lives. The search for genuine connection and a moral anchor in an increasingly complex world is a timeless human endeavor. Dostoevsky prompts us to reflect on the purpose of justice and punishment. Is punishment merely retribution, or does it serve a rehabilitative function? Porfiry Petrovich's psychological approach, aiming to draw Raskolnikov to confession through his own conscience rather than purely external evidence, suggests a deeper understanding of justice. This resonates with contemporary debates about restorative justice, rehabilitation programs, and the idea that true societal healing requires more than just incarceration. It requires individuals to confront their actions and seek personal transformation. Now, let us turn to some thought-provoking questions that Dostoevsky's masterpiece compels us to consider, encouraging us to reflect on these timeless themes in our own lives. Do you believe that any individual can truly be extraordinary enough to transcend universal moral laws, or is Raskolnikov's theory fundamentally flawed? This question challenges our own perceptions of exceptionalism and the boundaries of ethical behavior. How much do our external circumstances, like poverty or social pressure, influence our moral choices? And to what extent are we always responsible for our actions? Reflect on the interplay between determinism and free will, a central tension in Raskolnikov's story. In what ways does society's current emphasis on success and achievement potentially encourage a form of Raskolnikov-like intellectual pride or justification of morally questionable actions? Consider modern pressures and their ethical implications. If you were Raskolnikov, would you have chosen Sonya's path of suffering and confession, or would you have sought to escape the consequences of your crime by any means necessary, perhaps even suicide like Svidrigailov? This asks us to confront our own capacity for moral courage and despair. Do you believe suffering can truly be a path to spiritual growth and redemption, or is it merely a painful experience to be avoided at all costs? Reflect on the transformative potential of hardship and personal challenges. How do fictional narratives like Crime and Punishment help us understand complex psychological states and moral dilemmas in a way that academic texts or news reports might not? Consider the unique power of storytelling. These questions invite us into a deeper dialogue with Dostoevsky, not just as readers of a classic novel, but as active participants in the ongoing human conversation about morality, guilt, and the elusive path to redemption. The novel does not offer easy answers, but rather a profound exploration of the journey itself. Outro as we conclude our journey through the shadowy streets and tormented mind of Rodion Raskolnikov, the profound brilliance of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment truly shines through. This novel is far more than a simple tale of murder and justice. It is an unforgettable exploration of the human psyche, a searing critique of intellectual arrogance, and a timeless testament to the redemptive power of suffering, humility, and unconditional love. Raskolnikov's ultimate realization that genuine freedom lies not in transcending moral laws, but in embracing human connection and spiritual truth resonates deeply. echoing our own struggles for meaning and purpose. The core message of Crime and Punishment is clear. Abstract theories, divorced from compassion and the inherent dignity of every human life, lead not to liberation but to profound psychological torment and alienation. True punishment, Dostoevsky powerfully illustrates, often resides within the conscience, far more potent than any external legal consequence. And yet, amidst this despair, there is hope. Through the unwavering faith and selfless love of Sonya Marmeladova, Raskolnikov embarks on an arduous path toward spiritual rebirth, teaching us that even after the gravest transgressions, redemption is possible through humility, confession, and the acceptance of suffering. If this exploration of Dostoevsky's genius has stirred your soul, we invite you to delve deeper into the rich tapestry of his work and other related philosophical inquiries. First, consider The Brothers Karamazov, another monumental novel by Dostoevsky, which expands on themes of faith, doubt, moral responsibility, and the nature of good and evil through the complex story of a patricide and its impact on a family. Second, you might explore Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky's earlier novella, which introduces the underground man, a bitter and alienated narrator who critiques rationalism and challenges the very foundations of human nature, providing an intellectual precursor to Raskolnikov's struggles. Third, for a comparative philosophical perspective, delve into the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly his concept of the Übermensch overman. While Dostoevsky predates Nietzsche, Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory offers a fascinating contrast to Nietzsche's ideas, allowing for a deeper understanding of the enduring debate about human potential and moral transcendence. Finally, consider the broader philosophical movement of existentialism. Authors like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre explored themes of freedom, responsibility, alienation, and the search for meaning in a seemingly absurd world, ideas that Dostoevsky profoundly grappled with in Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment reminds us that the battle between good and evil, between pride and humility, is not just fought on grand stages, but within the silent chambers of the human heart. It challenges us to look within, to question our own justifications, and to seek out the redemptive power of compassion and connection in a world that so often tempts us towards isolation. Thank you for joining us on this profound exploration. May Dostoevsky's timeless insights continue to illuminate your own journey, prompting reflection and fostering a deeper understanding of the enduring human spirit. Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's vision of redemption through suffering. Hook and intro. Have you ever wondered what drives a person to commit an unthinkable act, not out of malice or madness, but from a calculated philosophical conviction? What if they believed their actions, however horrific, were for the greater good, a necessary step towards a better world? And what happens when the cold, detached logic of the intellect collides with the undeniable, scorching fire of human conscience? These are the profound, timeless questions that Fyodor Dostoevsky grapples with in his monumental novel, Crime and Punishment. At its heart, Crime and Punishment is not merely a gripping tale of murder and detection. It is a searing psychological journey into the mind of Rodion Raskolnikov, an impoverished former student who concocts a theory that divides humanity into ordinary and extraordinary individuals. He believes these extraordinary few, like historical figures such as Napoleon, possess the moral right to transgress laws, even commit murder if it serves a higher, transformative purpose. Our core theme today is an exploration of the perilous illusion of intellectual superiority and the profound, redemptive power of suffering and genuine human connection. This novel, published in 1866, remains startlingly relevant in our modern world, where abstract ideologies can still justify extreme actions, and where the search for individual meaning often clashes with universal moral principles. Dostoevsky challenges us to look beyond simplistic notions of good and evil, crime and punishment. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that while the intellect can rationalize almost anything, the human soul possesses an inherent moral compass that cannot be easily silenced. When that compass is ignored, the resulting torment is far more devastating than any legal consequence. In a world increasingly driven by rationalism, data, and the pursuit of individual achievement, Dostoevsky's masterpiece offers a crucial counter-narrative. It reminds us that true freedom and profound meaning are not found in intellectual detachment or the transgression of moral law, but in humble submission to a higher moral order. The courageous acceptance of suffering and the embrace of communal love and empathy. This is a story about the ultimate failure of a philosophy born of pride and the arduous yet ultimately liberating path to spiritual rebirth. It is a story that compels us to examine our own justifications, our own pride, and our own capacity for both darkness and light. Join us as we unravel the intricate layers of Raskolnikov's tormented psyche, delve into the gritty streets of St. Petersburg, and witness the transformative power of a suffering that leads not to despair but to a fragile, hard-won redemption. By the end of this video, you will have a deeper understanding of why Crime and Punishment continues to resonate with readers centuries later, offering timeless insights into the human condition, the nature of morality, and the enduring search for meaning in a complex world. Context and background: to truly appreciate the depth and impact of Crime and Punishment, we must first immerse ourselves in the tumultuous world that shaped its author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and the very fabric of 19th-century Russia. Born in 1821, Dostoevsky's own life was a crucible of profound experiences that directly informed his literary genius. He endured personal tragedy, severe epilepsy, and the constant burden of financial hardship. However, perhaps the most pivotal event in his life was his arrest in 1849 for his involvement with a liberal intellectual discussion group. Dostoevsky was sentenced to death by firing squad. He faced a mock execution, standing before the firing line only to receive a last-minute reprieve, commuting his sentence to hard labor and exile in Siberia. This harrowing experience, a direct confrontation with mortality and immense suffering, profoundly altered his worldview. He emerged from Siberia a fervent critic of the atheistic, rationalist, and socialist ideas that had attracted him in his youth, embracing instead a deep, personal Christian faith. These experiences provided him with an unparalleled understanding of guilt, suffering, and the human capacity for both degradation and redemption, themes he would relentlessly explore throughout his literary career. Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, was Dostoevsky's first major novel after his return from Siberia, and it is saturated with the intellectual and social ferment of mid-19th century Russia. This was a period of intense upheaval following the abolition of serfdom in 1861, which, while liberating, also led to widespread poverty and social dislocation in the burgeoning urban centers. St. Petersburg, the novel's primary setting, is depicted not as a grand imperial capital, but as a suffocating, squalid, and feverish labyrinth of cramped apartments, taverns, and narrow, dusty streets. Its oppressive atmosphere mirrors Raskolnikov's internal torment, becoming almost a character in itself. Intellectually, Russia was grappling with the influx of Western European ideas such as utilitarianism, which sought to justify actions based on their perceived societal benefit, and nihilism, which questioned all traditional moral and religious values. Young, educated Russians, often impoverished and frustrated by the slow pace of reform, were particularly drawn to these radical philosophies. Dostoevsky saw these ideologies as dangerously abstract, detached from the spiritual and moral realities of human existence, and believed they could lead to moral decay and social chaos. Crime and Punishment can be seen as his profound counterargument, a literary experiment designed to expose the destructive consequences of such ideas when taken to their logical, terrifying conclusion. The novel's protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a former law student living in abject poverty in St. Petersburg. He is a handsome, intelligent, but deeply proud and alienated young man. He lives in a tiny, claustrophobic room that he calls a closet or coffin, further exacerbating his sense of isolation and despair. He has ceased attending university, unable to afford tuition, and spends his days brooding over his radical philosophical theories. He has pawned his last valuables to an old, avaricious pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, whom he views as a useless, harmful louse preying on the poor. Raskolnikov nurses a dangerous theory. Humanity is divided into ordinary people who must obey the law, and extraordinary people who have the right, even the duty, to transgress moral and legal boundaries if their actions serve a higher purpose. He envisions himself as one of these extraordinary men, a potential Napoleon who can shed a little blood for the greater good of humanity. He rationalizes that by eliminating the useless pawnbroker, he could use her money to launch his own career and help countless others, including his own impoverished family. This intellectual conceit is the primary driver of his crime. One sweltering summer evening, Raskolnikov carries out his plan. He enters Alyona Ivanovna's apartment, feigning a visit to pawn an item. With an axe he has meticulously hidden, he brutally murders the old woman. The act is not clean or triumphant, but messy, horrifying, and immediately disorienting. As he attempts to steal her meager valuables, a terrifying turn of events occurs. Alyona's gentle, innocent half-sister, Lizaveta, unexpectedly returns home. Caught in a moment of panic and fearing discovery, Raskolnikov murders her as well. This unplanned second murder shatters his intellectual justifications and plunges him deeper into a moral abyss. The immediate aftermath is a blur of panic and near discovery. Raskolnikov barely escapes the scene, leaving behind a crucial clue, an empty purse he carelessly drops. He returns to his coffin of a room where he falls into a feverish delirium. His punishment begins not with legal authorities but with an excruciating psychological torment. He becomes intensely paranoid, believing everyone knows his secret. He isolates himself from everyone, including his loyal friend Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumikhin, another former student who is kind, energetic, and practical. Razumikhin tries to help Raskolnikov with job opportunities and financial support, but Raskolnikov's guilt-ridden paranoia pushes him away. Raskolnikov's family consists of his virtuous and self-sacrificing mother, Pulcheria Alexandrovna, and his intelligent, beautiful sister, Avdotia Romanovna, known as Dunya. They arrive in St. Petersburg, having endured their own hardships. Dunya has broken off an engagement to a wealthy but manipulative lawyer named Fyodor Petrovich Luzhin, who desired to marry a poor woman so she would be eternally grateful and subservient. Luzhin's self-serving utilitarianism, where everything is calculated for personal gain, parallels Raskolnikov's own intellectual detachment, albeit in a different moral register. During this period, Raskolnikov encounters the Marmeladov family, whose destitution embodies the novel's social commentary. Semyon Zakharovich Marmeladov is a former civil servant, a pitiful alcoholic who wastes his family's last kopecks on drink. His second wife, Katerina Ivanovna, is a proud but consumptive woman who tragically attempts to maintain a semblance of dignity amidst their utter poverty. Their eldest daughter, Sonya Marmeladova, Raskolnikov's future spiritual guide, is forced into prostitution to support the family. Sonya embodies Christian humility, self-sacrifice, and unconditional love, representing the antithesis of Raskolnikov's intellectual pride. The cat-and-mouse game between Raskolnikov and the astute investigating magistrate Porfiry Petrovich forms a significant part of the narrative. Porfiry is a master of psychological manipulation, never directly accusing Raskolnikov but subtly drawing him out, playing on his pride and guilt. Porfiry understands Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory, having read Raskolnikov's published article, and uses this knowledge to dismantle Raskolnikov's defenses. He states that Raskolnikov is suffering not from the fear of legal punishment, but from his inability to reconcile his intellectual justifications with his innate moral conscience. As Raskolnikov's psychological torment intensifies, he is drawn to Sonya. He confesses his crime to her, attempting to justify it with his theory. Sonya, horrified but filled with boundless compassion, urges him to confess publicly, to accept his suffering, and to find redemption through God. She represents the only path out of his spiritual abyss. Another key character is Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, a cynical, debauched nobleman who pursued Dunya in the past. Svidrigailov, a man who has transgressed moral boundaries without apparent guilt, serves as a dark double to Raskolnikov, showing a potential path Raskolnikov might have taken if his conscience had truly been silenced. However, Svidrigailov's ultimate despair and suicide highlight the emptiness of a life lived without moral anchor. Finally, driven by his unbearable guilt and Sonya's unwavering influence, Raskolnikov confesses his crime in a public square, then to the police. He is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. Sonya follows him to Siberia, enduring the harsh conditions to offer him spiritual support. The epilogue depicts Raskolnikov's slow, arduous journey towards spiritual regeneration. Initially, he struggles with his repentance, still clinging to his intellectual pride and regretting only that he was not strong enough to truly transcend morality. But through Sonya's enduring love and his own suffering, a new life slowly begins to dawn for him, one founded on humility, faith, and a rediscovery of human connection. Core narrative and analysis, our journey into crime and punishment centers on the profound interplay between intellectual pride, the inescapable burden of conscience, and the arduous path to redemption through suffering and human connection. Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory is not just a plot device. It is the philosophical core that Dostoevsky meticulously dissects and ultimately demolishes. Raskolnikov believes that some individuals are like great historical figures, such as Napoleon, whose genius allows them to step over conventional moral laws, including murder if it benefits humanity. He sees ordinary people as mere material who exist only to perpetuate the species, while extraordinary individuals are the true movers of history. This theory, born of a twisted utilitarianism and an inflated sense of self, becomes the catalyst for his crime. He rationalizes that Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker, is a useless parasite, and her death would free up her wealth for good causes, while society would be better off without her. This is the perilous illusion of intellectual superiority in action, the belief that cold reason can bypass human empathy and inherent moral truths. Dostoevsky shows us the chilling detachment required to arrive at such a conclusion. For example, Raskolnikov rehearses his crime with a carefully crafted plan, observing the pawnbroker's habits, measuring distances, and even practicing with a simulated weapon. This meticulous planning reflects his intellectual conviction that he is merely executing a logical experiment. However, the moment he commits the crime, his intellectual justifications crumble under the weight of brutal reality. The murders are messy, horrifying, and immediately plunge him into a state of profound psychological torment. His punishment is not the legal consequences he might face, but the agonizing internal battle that begins immediately after the act. He is consumed by fever, paranoia, and a debilitating sense of isolation. His conscience, which he believed he could transcend, relentlessly attacks him. Dostoevsky masterfully portrays this internal suffering through Raskolnikov's hallucinations, his physical ailments, and his overwhelming anxiety that everyone knows his secret. For instance, he repeatedly falls into a feverish delirium, waking up confused and disoriented, his thoughts swirling with fragments of the crime and fears of discovery. This psychological disintegration is the true punishment Dostoevsky emphasizes. Raskolnikov, despite his theory, cannot escape the moral fabric of his own being. He believes he is suffering because he is weak, not extraordinary enough to shed blood without consequence. This demonstrates his continued intellectual pride, his inability to see the inherent flaw in his theory itself rather than in his execution of it. His pride tells him he is a failed Superman, not that his Superman philosophy is inherently flawed. Raskolnikov's isolation is a direct consequence of his crime. He pushes away his caring friend Razumikhin, his loving mother and sister, and even finds himself repulsed by the very idea of human contact. He tries to cling to his intellectual solitude, believing it to be a mark of his superior status, but it only leads to utter despair and loneliness. This highlights Dostoevsky's belief in the fundamental human need for connection and belonging. To sever one's ties with humanity, even in theory, is to destroy oneself. Into this abyss steps Sonya Marmeladova, the embodiment of humility, faith, and unconditional love. Sonya, forced into prostitution to support her starving family, represents the direct antithesis of Raskolnikov's proud, rationalistic philosophy. She endures immense suffering, yet maintains an unwavering Christian faith and compassion. She does not judge Raskolnikov for his crime, instead. She offers him love and a path to spiritual healing. Her reading of the story of Lazarus, who was resurrected from the dead, is a pivotal moment. It is a symbolic invitation for Raskolnikov to undergo his own spiritual rebirth, to die to his old, prideful self and embrace a new life. Sonya's influence gradually chips away at Raskolnikov's intellectual defenses. She urges him to confess publicly, to go to the crossroads, bow down. Kiss the earth you have defiled and say to all the world, I am a murderer. This act of public confession, followed by the acceptance of punishment, is not about legal retribution for Dostoevsky. It is about an act of profound humility, a rejoining with the suffering of humanity, and a necessary step towards spiritual purification. For Dostoevsky, suffering is not merely a consequence of sin, it is a catalyst for rebirth, a crucible through which the soul is refined. And the astute investigator, Porfiry Petrovich, plays a crucial role in dismantling Raskolnikov's intellectual pride. Porfiry doesn't need physical evidence. He uses psychological insight, understanding Raskolnikov's theory and his internal conflict. Porfiry tells Raskolnikov it was wounded pride that made him ill. He sees that Raskolnikov's suffering is self-inflicted, a result of his inability to be as extraordinary as his theory demanded. Porfiry's calm, insightful questions force Raskolnikov to confront the absurdity and ultimate failure of his rationalizations, breaking his intellectual fortress brick by brick. Raskolnikov's eventual confession, though agonizing, marks the beginning of his potential redemption. It is not an act of fear, but an act driven by the unbearable weight of his conscience and Sonya's love. His exile to Siberia, a physically harsh and desolate place, becomes a symbolic journey of spiritual purification. In the epilogue, Raskolnikov is still struggling. He initially feels regret only for his failure as a Superman, not for the moral transgression itself. This illustrates the deep-seated nature of his intellectual pride. However, through Sonya's constant, unwavering presence and love and his own prolonged suffering, a profound shift begins to occur. He slowly starts to shed his intellectual arrogance and open his heart to faith and love. The novel ends with the promise of a new life, a spiritual regeneration that has just begun. This new life is found not in transcending moral law, but in embracing it through humility, accepting suffering, and connecting with others through love. It is a slow, gradual process, suggesting that redemption is not a single event but a continuous journey of self-discovery and spiritual growth. For instance, he begins to see the beauty in Sonya's unwavering devotion, a stark contrast to his own self-centered philosophy, and this sparks the first true stirrings of genuine love and empathy within him. Dostoevsky critiques rationalistic philosophies by showing their ultimate destructive potential when detached from empathy and spiritual grounding. Raskolnikov's theory bears a superficial resemblance to later Nietzschean concepts of the Übermensch or overman, where an individual transcends conventional morality to create new values. However, Dostoevsky's narrative offers a profound counterargument. Such transcendence, when based purely on individual will and intellectual pride, leads to isolation, suffering, and moral destruction. True transcendence, Dostoevsky implies, comes not from defying God, but from humbly embracing divine love and the inherent moral order of the universe. Furthermore, the novel critiques the dangers of a distorted utilitarianism, where the greatest good is used to justify the sacrifice of individual human lives. Raskolnikov's decision to murder the useless pawnbroker for the benefit of many is a chilling example of this. Dostoevsky demonstrates that such calculations inevitably lead to the dehumanization of others and the corruption of the self. The lives of even the ordinary or useless possess inherent dignity and value, a truth that Raskolnikov's theory utterly fails to grasp. The theme of alienation is powerful. Raskolnikov's act of murder isolates him not just from society but from his own humanity. He tries to stand apart, to be an extraordinary man, but this only condemns him to a lonely hell. The contrast with Sonya, who, despite her forced prostitution, remains deeply connected to humanity and God through her compassion and faith, is striking. She is a beacon showing that even in the most degraded circumstances, human connection and spiritual integrity can endure and offer a path to salvation. For example, Sonya consistently puts the needs of her family and later Raskolnikov before her own, embodying selfless love. In essence, Crime and Punishment is a powerful philosophical experiment. Dostoevsky places his protagonist within the crucible of his own radical ideas and demonstrates their catastrophic failure. He argues that reason, when divorced from morality, empathy, and faith, becomes a destructive force. The novel is a testament to the enduring power of the human conscience, the necessity of suffering for spiritual growth, and the redemptive force of unconditional love. It champions a profound humanism rooted in shared vulnerability and the interconnectedness of all souls, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating detachment of Raskolnikov's initial philosophy. Deep insight and reflection, the profound questions raised in Crime and Punishment transcend its 19th century Russian setting and resonate deeply with our modern world. The illusion of intellectual superiority and the redemptive power of suffering and connection are timeless themes that offer crucial insights into contemporary challenges. Consider the critique of ideological extremism. Raskolnikov's justification for murder based on a higher purpose or a greater good finds chilling parallels in various forms of extremism today. Whether it is political terrorism, radical cults, or online echo chambers that dehumanize the other, the core mechanism remains the same. Abstract ideas are prioritized over individual human lives and universal moral values. For example, extremist groups often rationalize violence against innocent civilians by arguing they are fighting for a purer society or a divine cause, viewing their victims as obstacles or ordinary people who must be sacrificed. This is Raskolnikov's theory amplified on a global scale. The novel also offers a potent warning against unchecked utilitarianism and the dangers of purely rational decision-making. In our age of advanced technology, artificial intelligence, and big data, there's a growing temptation to make decisions based solely on algorithms and the greatest good for the greatest number. But what happens when that calculation devalues individual rights or unique human experiences? For instance, in bioethical debates, decisions about resource allocation for life-saving treatments might be based on statistical outcomes, potentially overlooking the inherent dignity of each individual patient. Similarly, in urban planning, efficient solutions might displace communities for the greater good of economic development, echoing Raskolnikov's calculus with the pawnbroker. Dostoevsky's exploration of guilt, alienation, and the desperate need for human connection remains profoundly relevant to modern discussions on mental health. Raskolnikov's psychological breakdown is a powerful literary study of the debilitating effects of unaddressed guilt and the isolation it brings. In a world where mental health crises are increasingly prevalent, Dostoevsky reminds us that bottling up our transgressions, whether large or small, can lead to internal torment and profound loneliness. The path to healing often involves confession, seeking forgiveness, and reconnecting with supportive communities, much like Sonya offered to Raskolnikov. Examples include therapy practices that emphasize acknowledging past actions and seeking reconciliation, or support groups built on shared vulnerability and mutual understanding. The theme of suffering as a catalyst for growth also speaks to our contemporary understanding of resilience and personal transformation. While we naturally seek to avoid pain, Dostoevsky suggests that confronting and enduring suffering rather than evading it can lead to deeper self-awareness, empathy, and spiritual maturity. This doesn't glorify suffering for its own sake, but highlights its potential as a crucible for change. For example, individuals who overcome significant personal hardships, such as illness or loss, often emerge with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper appreciation for life, having undergone a profound internal shift that parallels Raskolnikov's journey towards redemption. Finally, the novel underscores the perennial human search for meaning and spiritual grounding in an increasingly secularized world. Raskolnikov's existential crisis, his attempt to forge his own morality, and his eventual turn towards faith reflect a universal human struggle. In an age where traditional institutions and beliefs are often questioned, Dostoevsky's work reminds us of the innate human need for a moral framework, a sense of belonging, and a connection to something larger than oneself. Here are some questions for you to ponder. Inspired by Dostoevsky's timeless masterpiece, The Ethics of the Greater Good, to what extent is it morally permissible to sacrifice individual well-being or rights for a perceived greater good for society? Can we truly justify stepping over certain moral boundaries? The power of conscience. Have you ever experienced a profound sense of guilt or internal conflict that no rationalization could silence? What does this tell you about the inherent moral compass within us? Suffering and transformation. Do you believe suffering can be a necessary path to personal growth and redemption, or is it always a destructive force? What role does our attitude towards suffering play? Intellect vs. empathy. In what areas of modern life do you see a dangerous overemphasis on cold intellect and logic at the expense of empathy, compassion, and human connection? Finding meaning in an often chaotic and indifferent world. Where do you find your sense of meaning, purpose, and moral guidance? Is it in reason, faith, community, or something else entirely? The nature of freedom. Is true freedom the absolute autonomy to act without constraint, or is it found in the responsible exercise of will within a moral and spiritual framework? What are the limits of personal freedom? Overcoming alienation. How can we foster deeper human connection and overcome feelings of alienation in an increasingly fragmented society? What role can compassion play in bridging divides? Outro Crime and Punishment is more than just a novel. It is a profound philosophical and psychological journey into the depths of the human soul. Dostoevsky demonstrates with searing clarity that the illusion of intellectual superiority, when divorced from empathy and a higher moral order, inevitably leads to profound suffering and alienation. He shows us that true punishment is not primarily external, but an internal, agonizing torment of conscience. Ultimately, the novel champions the redemptive power of suffering, humility, and unconditional love, offering a difficult but ultimately hopeful path to spiritual rebirth and genuine human connection. If Dostoevsky's exploration of the human condition has captivated you, there are countless other avenues to explore. You might delve deeper into his other masterpieces, such as The Brothers Karamazov, which further explores themes of faith, doubt, and the nature of good and evil through the story of a parricide and its impact on a family. Or perhaps Notes from Underground, a raw, unsettling confessional novella that delves into the mind of an alienated, bitter anti-hero, offering a powerful critique of rationalism and utopian ideals. You could also explore the broader philosophical movement of existentialism, which, though formally developing after Dostoevsky, owes much to his insights into freedom, responsibility, and the search for meaning in a seemingly absurd world. Thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard or Albert Camus pick up many of these threads. Or consider the historical context of nihilism and its continued influence on radical political thought, tracing its evolution from 19th century Russia to contemporary movements. What are your thoughts on Raskolnikov's journey? Do you believe his redemption was truly complete or merely the beginning of an ongoing struggle? What lessons from Crime and Punishment do you find most relevant to your own life today? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your insights enrich this ongoing conversation about one of literature's most enduring and impactful works. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. May Raskolnikov's arduous journey remind us all of the profound and often painful path to self-discovery, the inescapable power of our conscience, and the timeless, redemptive grace of human love and humility. Until next time, and keep exploring the rich tapestry of human thought and experience. Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's masterpiece of guilt and redemption. Hook and intro. Have you ever wondered what drives a person to commit an unspeakable act, not out of malice or greed, but out of a twisted intellectual conviction? What happens when a brilliant mind becomes convinced that certain individuals are above the law with the right to transgress for a perceived greater good? And what kind of punishment truly awaits such a person, not from the courts, but from the depths of their own soul? Today, we delve into one of literature's most profound psychological thrillers, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This isn't just a story about a murder, it's a harrowing descent into the mind of Rodion Raskolnikov, a tormented ex-student in 19th century St. Petersburg who grapples with these very questions. Dostoevsky doesn't just present a crime, he meticulously dissects the intellectual arrogance, the moral justifications, and the unbearable psychological fallout that follows. He forces us to confront the terrifying thought that perhaps the most brutal punishment isn't external, but an internal inferno of guilt, paranoia, and alienation. This novel isn't merely a literary classic, it's a timeless inquiry into the very essence of human morality, free will, and the arduous, often painful, path to redemption. Published in 1866, Crime and Punishment burst onto the literary scene, capturing the intellectual and social anxieties of a rapidly changing Russia. It immediately established Dostoevsky as a master of psychological realism, a writer unafraid to plumb the darkest depths of the human psyche. What makes this novel so enduringly popular even today is its raw honesty about the human condition. We see ourselves, our own moral ambiguities, and our search for meaning reflected in Raskolnikov's tormented journey. It challenges us to look beyond simplistic notions of good and evil, inviting us into a world where salvation is often found not through intellectual superiority, but through humility, suffering, and the transformative power of compassion. The story offers profound insights into the nature of guilt and how it can consume an individual, dissecting the intricate dance between rationalization and conscience. It explores the dangerous allure of radical ideologies that promise a new world order, yet often lead to dehumanization and suffering. More importantly, it celebrates the enduring strength of the human spirit to seek atonement and spiritual renewal, even after committing the most heinous acts. As you watch today's video, prepare to embark on a journey that is as intellectually stimulating as it is emotionally gripping. We will unravel the layers of Raskolnikov's mind, explore the social landscape that shaped him, and ultimately discover why Crime and Punishment continues to be a profound and deeply relevant masterpiece for contemporary readers. This novel doesn't just tell a story, it asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. It forces us to question the boundaries of morality, the limits of human reason, and the true cost of denying our shared humanity. By the end of this video, you will not only have a comprehensive understanding of Dostoevsky's genius, but also a deeper appreciation for the timeless questions he poses. Questions that resonate as powerfully now as they did over a century and a half ago. Let's begin our exploration of this monumental work. Context and background. To truly appreciate the genius of Crime and Punishment, we must first understand the man behind the masterpiece, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and the turbulent world in which he lived and wrote. Born in 1821, Dostoevsky's own life was a crucible of suffering and spiritual awakening, experiences that profoundly shaped his unique literary voice. He endured poverty, gambling addiction, and the constant threat of illness. But nothing impacted him more profoundly than his encounter with the Tsarist justice system. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for his involvement with the Petrashevsky Circle, a group of liberal intellectuals who discussed radical social theories. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, a sentence that was commuted to hard labor in Siberia at the very last moment as he stood before the executioners. This mock execution and his subsequent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, followed by 6 years of compulsory military service, fundamentally altered his worldview. He witnessed human degradation and resilience firsthand, deepening his understanding of sin, suffering, and the possibility of spiritual redemption. These harrowing experiences, a form of personal punishment and resurrection, became the bedrock of his most celebrated works, including Crime and Punishment, his first great novel after his Siberian exile. The Russia of the 1860s, the setting for Crime and Punishment, was a nation in flux. Tsar Alexander Roman II had emancipated the serfs in 1861, a monumental reform that, while liberating millions, also destabilized society, leading to mass migration to cities, unemployment, and widespread social unrest. St. Petersburg, Russia's imperial capital, became a sprawling metropolis of stark contrasts. Grand palaces stood alongside teeming slums where poverty, squalor, and desperation festered. Dostoevsky vividly captures this suffocating atmosphere, making the city itself almost a character in the novel. Its cramped rooms, oppressive heat, and crowded streets mirror the psychological confinement and moral decay of its inhabitants. Intellectually, Russia was ablaze with radical new ideas imported from Western Europe. Nihilism, utilitarianism, and rational egoism were gaining traction among the young intelligentsia, challenging traditional religious faith and moral codes. These philosophies, particularly those advocating that reason alone could provide a complete moral framework, deeply troubled Dostoevsky, who saw them as a dangerous detachment from spiritual and humanistic values. Crime and Punishment is, in many ways, Dostoevsky's literary response to these intellectual currents, a powerful critique of abstract theories that he believed could justify heinous acts and lead to spiritual ruin. Against this backdrop, we meet Rodion Raskolnikov, the protagonist of our story. He is a brilliant but impoverished former law student living in a suffocating attic room in St. Petersburg. His mind is a cauldron of conflicting ideas, fueled by his desperate circumstances and the radical philosophies he has absorbed. Raskolnikov is deeply alienated from society, consumed by intellectual pride, and convinced of his own exceptionalism. He despises the moral apathy and hypocrisy he sees around him, particularly the wealthy, miserly old pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna, whom he views as a louse who preys on the poor. Driven by a complex mix of poverty, disdain for society, and his self-developed theory that extraordinary men have the right to transgress moral laws for a greater good, Raskolnikov plans and executes the murder of Alyona Ivanovna. His intention is to use her money to launch a brilliant career, thus proving his extraordinary status and benefiting humanity. However, a cruel twist of fate leads him to also murder Alyona's innocent half-sister, Lizaveta, who unexpectedly walks in on the crime. This second, unplanned murder shatters Raskolnikov's intellectual justifications and plunges him into an abyss of guilt and paranoia. The novel then meticulously chronicles Raskolnikov's psychological torment in the aftermath of the murders. He succumbs to fever, delirium, and a crushing sense of isolation. His carefully constructed intellectual world crumbles under the weight of his conscience. He wanders the streets of St. Petersburg in a daze, haunted by his crime, constantly fearing detection and struggling to reconcile his actions with his internal moral compass. He experiences vivid dreams and hallucinations that serve as symbolic representations of his guilt and subconscious fears. Throughout his ordeal, Raskolnikov interacts with a cast of unforgettable characters who serve as foils and catalysts in his journey. There is Razumikhin, his loyal and good-hearted friend who embodies pragmatism and selfless devotion, constantly trying to help Raskolnikov despite his erratic behavior. Then there is Porfiry Petrovich, the shrewd and psychologically astute investigative magistrate, who, without concrete evidence, engages Raskolnikov in a masterful game of cat and mouse, subtly probing his guilt and pushing him towards confession through psychological manipulation rather than brute force. Porfiry represents the inescapable nature of justice, not just legal but moral and psychological. But perhaps the most pivotal character is Sonya Marmeladova, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her impoverished alcoholic family. Sonya, despite her degraded social status, embodies pure Christian faith, humility, and unconditional love. Her suffering is embraced with a quiet dignity, and her unwavering compassion for Raskolnikov, even after he confesses his horrifying crime to her, offers him the only genuine path to spiritual redemption. She represents the antithesis of Raskolnikov's intellectual pride, showing him that true strength lies in humility and self-sacrifice, not in transgression. The climax of the novel arrives as Raskolnikov, driven to the brink of madness by his guilt and under Sonya's unwavering influence, finally confesses his crime to the authorities. This act of confession is not a defeat, but the first step towards his spiritual rebirth. He is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. The epilogue finds Raskolnikov and Sonya together in the desolate Siberian landscape, where through Sonya's enduring love and his own prolonged suffering, he begins the slow and arduous process of moral and spiritual regeneration, accepting his punishment not as a burden, but as a crucible for a new life. Core narrative and analysis at the heart of Crime and Punishment lies Rodion Raskolnikov's radical philosophy, the extraordinary man theory. He posits that society is fundamentally divided into two types of people, the ordinary or lice, who are destined to live in submission following conventional laws and moral codes, and the extraordinary, who possess the right to transgress these laws even to the point of violence, if their actions contribute to a greater good or advance humanity. Raskolnikov sees himself as one of these extraordinary individuals, entitled to eliminate a useless old pawnbroker to fund his own genius and by extension benefit society. He imagines figures like Napoleon, who carved empires through bloodshed, as precedents for his own transgressive ambition. Dostoevsky masterfully portrays Raskolnikov's intellectual arrogance, showing how abstract theories, when divorced from empathy and human connection, can rationalize even the most heinous acts. Raskolnikov's crime is not a spontaneous act of passion or greed, but a meticulously planned experiment to test his theory and assert his supposed superiority. He believes he can commit murder without feeling guilt, that his intellect will shield him from the moral consequences. However, the unexpected murder of Lizaveta, the pawnbroker's innocent sister, shatters his carefully constructed rationalizations, exposing the chasm between his abstract ideas and the brutal reality of human suffering. This brings us to the novel's profound exploration of punishment, which Dostoevsky argues is far more internal and psychological than external and legal. Raskolnikov's true punishment begins immediately after the crime, manifesting as a debilitating psychological torment. He is consumed by fever, delirium, and an overwhelming paranoia. Every sound, every glance from a stranger, every conversation becomes a potential threat, a sign of his impending exposure. His intellectual pride crumbles, replaced by a crushing burden of guilt that isolates him from everyone he knows and loves. For instance, after the murders, Raskolnikov becomes physically ill, confined to his room in a state of semi-consciousness, plagued by nightmares. He avoids human contact, unable to endure the company of his loving sister, Dunya, or his devoted friend, Razumikin, because their very presence underscores his alienation. His inability to connect, to simply be with others, is a direct consequence of his crime. Another example of this internal punishment is his obsessive return to the crime scene, a morbid compulsion driven by his tormented conscience. He almost gets caught, not due to clever detective work, but because his own guilt draws him back, a moth to a flame. This psychological punishment is masterfully intensified through the character of Porfiry Petrovich, the shrewd investigative magistrate. Porfiry rarely resorts to direct accusation or material evidence. Instead, he engages Raskolnikov in subtle philosophical duels, dissecting his psychological state with uncanny precision. He understands Raskolnikov's pride and intellectual vanity, using them as tools to unravel his guilt. During one interrogation, Porfiry discusses a newspaper article written by Raskolnikov himself, which outlines the extraordinary man theory, perfectly knowing it is Raskolnikov's own justification. This intellectual cat-and-mouse game forces Raskolnikov to confront his own ideas and their horrifying implications, making the internal struggle even more acute. In stark contrast to Raskolnikov's nihilistic rationalism stands Sonya Marmeladova, the embodiment of faith, compassion, and redemption. Sonya, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her starving family, represents profound human suffering embraced with humility and unwavering Christian faith. Despite her degraded circumstances, she possesses an inner purity and moral strength that profoundly affects Raskolnikov. She believes in the power of confession, suffering, and divine mercy as the only path to absolution. Her role is not to judge, but to love and guide. A pivotal scene illustrating Sonya's role is when Raskolnikov, at the height of his torment, confesses his crime to her. He pours out his soul, explaining his theory and the horror of his deeds. Sonya's reaction is not condemnation, but profound pity and compassion. She urges him to confess publicly, to go to the crossroads. Bow down to the people, kiss the earth, for you have sinned before it, and say aloud to the whole world, I am a murderer. She then reads him the biblical story of Lazarus's resurrection, symbolizing the possibility of spiritual rebirth even for the most morally dead. This moment is Raskolnikov's first true glimpse of hope, a counterpoint to his intellectual despair. This dynamic highlights one of Dostoevsky's core philosophical arguments: the conflict between pure reason and spiritual faith, or between intellect and empathy. Raskolnikov's over-reliance on cold, abstract reason, detached from human feeling, leads him to transgression and spiritual death. Sonya, on the other hand, embodies a faith-based morality, driven by compassion and sacrifice, which offers the only true path to life and redemption. Dostoevsky suggests that intellectual pride, when it elevates itself above universal moral and spiritual values, is ultimately destructive. Reason alone cannot provide a sufficient moral framework for human existence. Faith, humility, and love are essential for understanding true humanity and achieving spiritual well-being. The oppressive urban landscape of St. Petersburg also plays a crucial role as a symbolic character. The city's suffocating heat, poverty-stricken tenements, and labyrinthine streets are not just a backdrop. They mirror Raskolnikov's internal state of feverish agitation and psychological distress. His cramped, coffin-like room symbolizes his isolation and intellectual confinement, reflecting his detachment from the normal world. The pervasive sense of squalor and moral miasma in the city amplifies the psychological realism, contributing to Raskolnikov's sense of entrapment and his desperate actions. For example, when Raskolnikov goes out, the descriptions of the sweltering heat, the suffocating dust, and the drunkards on the streets often heighten his own mental anguish and disgust with humanity. The physical environment directly amplifies his internal turmoil. Another instance is the description of the Marmeladov's squalid living conditions, which vividly portrays the extreme poverty that forces Sonya into prostitution and fuels Raskolnikov's anger at societal injustice, further rationalizing his crime in his mind. The city acts as a constant reminder of both the external and internal decay that permeate the narrative. Dostoevsky's narrative structure is also a masterclass in literary innovation. He blends elements of a detective novel with a profound psychological study and a philosophical treatise. The reader is often granted intimate access to Raskolnikov's tormented consciousness through extensive internal monologues, feverish thoughts, and fragmented dreams. This unique perspective allows for a multi-layered exploration of the novel's complex themes, keeping the reader deeply immersed in Raskolnikov's internal struggle. The suspense is not just about whether Raskolnikov will be caught, but how his mind will unravel and whether he can find a path to redemption. The polyphonic structure, a concept later theorized by Mikhail Bakhtin, is evident in the novel's dialogic nature, where multiple independent voices and ideologies, Raskolnikov's rationalism, Sonya's faith, Porfiry's psychological cunning, Razumikin's pragmatism, exist in dynamic tension without being fully subsumed by a single authorial voice. This allows for a richer, more complex exploration of the philosophical questions at hand, as no single character holds all the answers and the truth emerges from their clashes and interactions. This innovative approach to storytelling marked a significant departure from traditional literary forms and profoundly influenced subsequent generations of writers. Deep insight and reflection, Crime and Punishment transcends its 19th century Russian context to offer profound insights into perennial human struggles that remain acutely relevant today. One of its most potent warnings is against the dangers of ideological extremism. Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory, which justifies violence for a perceived greater good, resonates chillingly with modern concerns about terrorism, political radicalization, and the spread of abstract ideologies that dehumanize individuals and rationalize cruelty. For example, we see echoes of Raskolnikov's detached intellectualism in online echo chambers where radical ideas fester, leading individuals to believe their cause is so righteous that conventional morality no longer applies. Similarly, historical instances of totalitarian regimes demonstrate how abstract theories about racial purity or economic class struggle led to unimaginable suffering, mirroring Raskolnikov's intellectual pride. The novel warns us that when empathy is sacrificed at the altar of ideology, immense human tragedy is often the result. Furthermore, Dostoevsky's pioneering exploration of the human psyche, particularly the debilitating effects of guilt, paranoia, and alienation, offers timeless insights into mental health. Raskolnikov's descent into feverish delirium and overwhelming anxiety is a powerful depiction of the psychological toll of moral transgression. This resonates deeply with contemporary discussions about the mental health crisis, the burden of unaddressed trauma, and the importance of confession, therapy, and seeking connection. Consider modern individuals struggling with addiction, depression, or PTSD. The sense of isolation and the internal battles they face often parallel Raskolnikov's torment. The novel implicitly champions the therapeutic power of acknowledging one's mistakes and seeking human connection and forgiveness as pathways to healing. For instance, support groups often emphasize confession and shared experience, echoing Sonya's role in Raskolnikov's journey towards acknowledging his suffering and seeking absolution. The novel's stark depiction of poverty and social inequality in 19th century St. Petersburg also remains deeply relevant. The plight of the Marmeladov family forced into desperate measures highlights how systemic injustice and economic hardship can drive individuals to moral compromises or radical despair. This connects to contemporary discussions about social justice, wealth disparity, and the societal conditions that breed discontent and unrest. Think of the ongoing debates about universal basic income, affordable housing, or access to healthcare. These discussions are rooted in the same fundamental questions about social responsibility and the human cost of inequality that Dostoevsky explored. The novel serves as a powerful reminder that neglecting the suffering of the most vulnerable can have profound and far-reaching consequences, both for individuals and for the fabric of society. Finally, Crime and Punishment is an enduring exploration of the universal human quest for meaning and identity. Raskolnikov's initial belief that he could forge his own meaning through a transgressive act ultimately leads him to an existential void. His journey towards redemption, however arduous, offers a path to finding meaning not in intellectual superiority, but in humility, compassion, and shared humanity. This resonates with modern readers grappling with existential questions in an increasingly secular and complex world. We live in a world that often struggles with purpose, seeking validation through material success or fleeting trends. Dostoevsky reminds us that true meaning might lie in our capacity for love, forgiveness, and connection, in accepting our shared vulnerability rather than striving for artificial superiority. Sonya's unwavering faith, even amidst her degradation, offers a profound alternative to Raskolnikov's nihilistic despair, suggesting that spiritual insight and human empathy are essential guides for a meaningful life. Now, let's reflect on some profound questions this masterpiece leaves us with. To what extent can abstract philosophical ideas, like Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory, justify actions that violate fundamental human morality? Do you believe true punishment for a crime is primarily external legal sanctions or internal psychological torment and guilt? Can one truly exist without the other? How does the novel challenge our understanding of heroism and villainy, blurring the lines between a would-be benefactor and a cold-blooded murderer? In what ways does Dostoevsky suggest that suffering can be a catalyst for spiritual growth and redemption, rather than simply a negative experience? How relevant is Sonya Marmeladova's unwavering faith and compassion as a moral compass in today's often cynical and secular world? The novel critiques intellectual pride when divorced from empathy. Where do you see similar warnings or examples in contemporary society or individual lives? Do you think Raskolnikov's ultimate redemption in Siberia is fully convincing, or does Dostoevsky leave some ambiguity about the depth of his transformation? These questions invite us to engage deeply with Dostoevsky's vision, considering the enduring power of conscience, the fragility of human reason, and the timeless pursuit of meaning and redemption. The novel doesn't offer easy answers, but rather a profound exploration of what it means to be human in all its flawed, striving glory. Outrogue Crime and Punishment stands as a monumental achievement in literature, a testament to Fyodor Dostoevsky's unparalleled ability to dissect the human psyche and confront the most challenging moral and philosophical questions. It reminds us that true punishment often resides not in external judgment, but in the internal torment of a conscience ravaged by guilt and alienation. More importantly, it offers a glimmer of hope, suggesting that even after the deepest transgression, the path to redemption can be found through humility, suffering, and the transformative power of love and compassion. This novel is more than a story. It is an enduring mirror reflecting our own struggles with morality, our susceptibility to dangerous ideologies, and our innate human need for connection and forgiveness. It challenges us to look beyond superficial judgments and to consider the profound psychological and spiritual forces that shape our actions and our destinies. As we close our journey into the world of Raskolnikov, remember the profound insights Dostoevsky offers about the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of spiritual renewal, even from the darkest depths. If you found this exploration of crime and punishment thought-provoking, you might be interested in delving deeper into other works that grapple with similar themes. Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, often considered his magnum opus. This novel continues his exploration of faith, doubt, morality, and the nature of good and evil through the story of a parricide and the lives of the Karamazov brothers, particularly the intellectual Ivan and the spiritual Alyosha. It's an even grander philosophical and psychological epic. Albert Camus's The Stranger, for a contrasting existentialist perspective on crime and moral indifference. Camus's novel explores a man who commits a seemingly motiveless murder and faces the absurdity of existence and the indifference of the universe. It offers a different take on the consequences of detachment. Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, while different in style, Tolstoy's novel, a contemporary of Dostoevsky's, also explores themes of societal judgment, moral transgression, and the search for meaning, albeit through a sprawling social realism rather than intense psychological introspection. It presents a powerful parallel in its examination of an individual defying societal norms. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, this epic novel offers a powerful narrative of crime, punishment, and redemption through the character of Jean Valjean, who spends decades evading an obsessed inspector after stealing a loaf of bread. It explores societal injustice, mercy, and the capacity for moral transformation, resonating deeply with Dostoevsky's themes. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into crime and punishment. May Raskolnikov's struggle inspire you to reflect on your own moral compass and to seek connection and compassion in a world that often desperately needs it. Stay curious, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next video.